It's a very strange feeling to wake up every morning and feel like you are somehow both sprinting a marathon, and completely standing still.
Yeah, that paradox is incredibly real right now.
Right, like you are trapped in this bizarre paradox where history is just, I don't know, stuck on fast forward.
Right, where major world-altering events seem to happen like every other Tuesday.
Exactly, and yet your actual daily life often feels heavily scheduled, repetitive, and just deeply, inexplicably exhausting.
It's the defining mood of the era, honestly.
It really is. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are thrilled you're here with us because our mission today is to unpack a highly analytical framework that attempts to make sense of exactly that paradox.
We're diving into a really comprehensive psychological and historical map of the 2020s.
Right, covering the initial shock of 2020 all the way through the reality check of early 2026, which is where we are now.
And, what makes this framework so compelling isn't just the timeline of events. I mean, anyone can look up a timeline on Wikipedia.
Yeah, exactly.
What we are exploring today is an explanation of the underlying mechanics. It digs into the why.
The why is the most important part.
Right. Like, why does the world feel the exact way it does right now? And to do that, the source provides this psychological architecture for the absolute whiplash humanity has been experiencing.
Whiplash is the perfect word for it.
It really is looking at the sheer velocity of structural change over the last 6 years.
And that concept of velocity is exactly where I want to ground this conversation for you, the listener.
And that's crucial context.
Because when we talk about the velocity of change in the 2020s, we are inevitably going to brush up against some massive, deeply polarizing shifts.
Oh, absolutely.
We're going to be exploring intense turbulence in U.S. presidential administrations, a flurry of deeply controversial Supreme Court rulings, and, severe global conflict.
That's the heavy stuff.
The heavy stuff. So I want to be completely clear right off the bat. We are looking at these policy shifts and political events purely as seismic shocks to the system.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
We're essentially just measuring the Richter scale of the earthquake here.
Right. Neither of us is taking a side, endorsing a viewpoint, or making moral judgments on the policies themselves.
No, not at all.
Our job today is to impartially break down the timeline and the societal impacts exactly as they are mapped out in the source text, focusing purely on the mechanics of how these changes rewired our daily lives.
And that distinction is so vital. Because if you get caught up in debating whether a specific shock was, politically good or bad.
Which is easy to do.
Very easy to do. But if you do that, you miss the broader cumulative effect of all those shocks hitting a population simultaneously.
Right.
The central argument we're looking at is that you cannot simply absorb that much structural change without profound psychological consequences.
Absolutely.
But interestingly, to understand the breakage of the 2020s, the source insists we actually have to rewind.
Right. We can't just start in 2020.
Exactly. We have to look at the cracks that formed before the earthquake even hit. We have to look at the 2010s.
Okay, let's unpack this. The emotional prologue. And I want to spend some real time here because the way this framework diagnoses the 2010s is fascinating.
It's incredibly revealing, yeah.
Because it wasn't just a quiet decade leading up to a global pandemic. It was a period where the fundamental way human beings perceive reality, truth, and identity underwent a radical mutation.
That's a great way to put it.
It's like, okay, think of it like this. It's like in the 2010s, the internet went from being a funhouse mirror we occasionally looked into for amusement to becoming the actual window we viewed the entire world through.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Right. And suddenly, millions of people realized the glass was permanently warped, distorting everything outside, but nobody knew how to take the window down.
I'd actually push that analogy a step further, though.
Oh, yeah? How so?
Well, it wasn't just that the window was warped. It was that we were legally and economically mandated to keep looking through it.
Oh, wow. Yeah, you couldn't opt out.
Exactly. You couldn't opt out. The internet stopped being a destination like a physical place you visited when you sat down at a bulky desktop computer, and it became this inescapable, invisible layer draped over the physical world.
That is so true. It was just suddenly everywhere, all the time.
And the framework identifies 5 specific structural cracks that formed under the weight of that transition.
Okay, let's really dig into those cracks, because if you're listening to this, you're going to recognize exactly how these felt.
Oh, universally.
The first structural weakness was the nature of connection itself. The source argues that connection became performative. It became exhausting.
Right, because for, the the entirety of human history. Connection was bound by physical geography and biological bandwidth.
You couldn't know 1,000 people.
Exactly. You knew the people in your village, your town, your school. But in the 2010s, with the absolute saturation of smartphones and algorithmic social media, we achieved peak hyperconnection.
We were suddenly plugged into everyone.
Yes, but the psychological trade-off was immense. You could see everyone, you could observe their perfectly curated vacations, their meals, their milestones, but you felt known by no one.
But wait, let me push back on that a little. Wasn't there always a performative element to society?
Sure, to some degree.
Like even in the 1990s or the early 2000s with MySpace, people were curating an image. So what made the 2010s so structurally fragile compared to that?
It's a fair question. The difference was ubiquity and metrics.
Ubiquity and metrics. Okay, break that down.
It wasn't just that you were performing, it was that your performance was being mathematically graded in real time by a corporation.
Oh, right. Likes, retweets, follower counts.
Exactly. And you carried the grading machine in your pocket 24/7. Connection shifted from being a baseline state of human existence to a competitive, quantifiable sport.
Which sounds exhausting just thinking about it.
It was. And when human connection is gamified like that, it inevitably corrupts the information flowing through the network.
Which brings us directly to the second crack the document highlights. Truth became negotiable.
Right. And this wasn't just an accident. It was an architectural feature of the platforms we were living on.
Because of the algorithms, right. The shift toward algorithmic seeds designed purely to maximize engagement.
Exactly. To keep your eyes on the screen at all costs. Because of that, news and information became intensely personalized.
So it was no longer about a geographical community sharing a common set of facts and, debating what to do about them.
No, information morphed into emotionally charged, highly reactive content tailored to your pre-existing biases.
Wow. And the psychological mechanism here is crucial, isn't it?
Very much so. When people are overwhelmed by conflicting, emotionally volatile information, cognitive fatigue sets in.
People just get too tired to check the facts.
Right. They literally don't have the energy to rigorously verify everything they see. So the question the public was asking fundamentally changed.
From what is true to something else.
Exactly. They stopped asking, what is empirically true?
Yeah.
They started asking, who do I trust?
And usually they chose to trust the voices that made them feel validated rather than informed.
Exactly. Which isolates people into these hermetically sealed echo chambers.
And once your shared sense of truth fractures, your sense of self is the next thing to crack, which is the third vulnerability the framework points out. Identity became a project.
Yes. It became a branding exercise.
So how did that manifest?
Well, the 2010s saw a massive overdue increase in the cultural awareness of mental health, systemic race issues, gender dynamics, and neurodivergence.
Right. A lot of important conversations were happening.
Yes, and while that brought necessary visibility, the framework notes a harsh psychological side effect. The burden of navigating all of this was placed entirely on the individual.
So you were no longer just living your life, you were constantly auditing yourself.
Right. You were under immense pressure to accurately label and represent your identity to an invisible, judgmental audience at all times.
Man, it's the mental overhead of being your own PR manager while you're just trying to, buy groceries.
It's incredibly draining.
And to cope with that absolute exhaustion, we arrive at the fourth crack. Convenience reached what the source calls escape velocity.
This is the era where the friction was completely removed from the physical world.
Right. Uber, DoorDash, one-click Prime shipping, algorithmic dating apps, infinite streaming queues.
We engineered a world where you could summon a stranger to bring you a burrito in 20 minutes without ever making a phone call.
But look at the psychological trade-off there.
It's massive.
Because when you eliminate all friction from daily life, you don't actually generate peace. You generate an intolerance for waiting.
Yes. We strip the natural pauses out of the human day.
Like the time spent walking to a store, or the time spent waiting for a cab, or even the commercial breaks on television.
Exactly. We gained unprecedented convenience, but we completely lost our patience.
And what did we do with that reclaimed time? We didn't rest.
No, we just used it to doom scroll more algorithmic content or answer more work emails.
We basically optimized our way into total burnout.
And when you combine a burnt-out population, a fractured sense of truth, and performative anxiety, you get the fifth and final crack of the 2010s.
Which is the absolute collapse of institutional trust.
Right. Government, traditional media, large corporations, academia, All of them saw their public trust absolutely plummet.
Because the glaring inequality became impossible to hide.
Exactly. People could look at their phones and see vast concentrations of wealth and these seamless technological miracles while their own local infrastructure was crumbling and their wages were stagnating.
So by the late 2010s, there was this pervasive ambient hum of anxiety.
Society was hyper-connected, technologically brilliant, but fundamentally running on emotional fumes.
So how did the average person survive that? Because we didn't just collectively collapse in 2018.
No, we kept going.
We kept going to work, we kept raising kids. This is where the framework introduces something it calls the subpersonality lens.
And I think this is one of the most revealing tools for understanding this era.
It theorizes that because the external world became so overwhelming and contradictory, people developed highly specific internal personas coping mechanisms just to get through the day.
Right, let's break these down because if you're listening, I guarantee you're going to recognize yourself or someone you love in these profiles.
Oh, 100%. Let's start with the persona they call Addie.
Okay, so Addie is the part of the human psyche that desperately seeks surface-level joy.
Addie lives in the memes, the viral dances, the pop culture moments.
Exactly. But the key insight here is that Addie isn't genuinely carefree.
No.
No, Addie is a defense mechanism. Addie is trying to keep the aesthetic vibe relentlessly bright and distracting, specifically to avoid confronting the creeping existential dread underneath.
Oh, wow. So it's the person in 2019 who was excessively curating a mood board for their apartment aesthetic while completely ignoring their student loan debt.
And the fact that the political climate was tearing their family apart?
Yes, Addie is the tactful retreat into positive vibes.
Exactly. But then, on the completely opposite end of the spectrum, you have Bannock.
Now, I look at the Bannock persona and I see almost every adult I know who is just trying to hold a family or a team together.
Bannock is the manifestation of frustrated responsibility.
They look around at the 2010s, see that truth is fragmented, see that everyone is performing, and feel this agonizing lack of structure.
Right. Bannock is the exhausted community leader, the burnt-out middle manager, the stressed-out parent.
They are carrying the heavy realization that there is no shared reality anymore, but they still have to figure out how to organize a group to get something done.
Bannock is essentially asking, how do we move forward when no one can even agree on what the ground is made of?
Man, I feel that. And while Bannock is trying to hold the pieces together, the Devon persona is just entirely checking out.
Devon is fascinating. Devon looks at the performative connection, the algorithms, the corporate branding, and just says, this is all fake and I refuse to participate.
Devon is the ultimate cynic.
Yes. They retreat from the mainstream. They distrust all the narratives.
For Devon, authenticity is so rare and so precious that they become fiercely guarded and selectively loyal only to a tiny, trusted circle.
Which is a very rational response to an environment saturated with manufactured consent.
True. But then you have the inverse of Devon, which the framework calls Liz.
Right. The Liz persona doesn't retreat from the chaos. She weaponizes it.
Liz is the part of us that masters the attention economy.
She understands that power has structurally shifted away from traditional slow-moving institutions and directly into the hands of individuals who know how to command perception.
She plays the algorithm.
Exactly. She knows how to optimize her aesthetic, how to craft a narrative, and how to monetize her own identity.
You know, I really struggle with the Liz persona, to be honest.
Why is that?
It just sounds incredibly cynical. It sounds like giving up on any kind of shared, deeper meaning just to play a video game where the points are likes and sponsorship deals.
I see what you mean.
Does the framework justify this as a healthy psychological response, or is Liz just a symptom of the disease?
Well, the framework doesn't assign morality to these personas. It views them strictly as survival mechanics.
Okay, so it's not about being good or bad.
Right. From an evolutionary psychology standpoint, Liz is highly adaptive.
Adaptive how?
If you are placed in an environment where visibility equals economic and social power, learning to manipulate visibility is a logical survival strategy.
Huh. So it's not about being authentic, it's about being effective in a distorted ecosystem.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is the emotional cliff we stood on at the end of 2019.
So take all of that, take the performative exhaustion, the algorithmically shattered truth, the loss of patience due to hyperconvenience, and this cocktail of coping mechanisms. Addie's forced joy, Bannock's exhaustion, Devon's cynicism, Liz's calculated performance.
A powder keg?
That is the exact psychological state of humanity standing on the precipice of December 31st, 2019.
We were a global society standing on an emotional cliff. The framework argues that the system was already primed for disruption,
We had built this incredibly complex, highly fragile machine.
and subconsciously, everyone was just waiting to see what would happen when the machine finally broke.
And the 2020s didn't just break the machine, they vaporized it.
They really did.
If the 2010s were the story of the system warping, the overarching tension of the 2020s became one massive, terrifying question.
Which is, how do you build a stable life in a world that keeps shifting violently underneath you?
Because it wasn't just one crisis. Health, the global economy, the nature of truth, the structure of work, political legitimacy, all of them became fundamentally unstable simultaneously.
And the way the framework maps this out year by year is crucial because it demonstrates how the human psyche had to constantly pivot just to stay sane.
Let's look at the onset in 2020. The document defines the core tension here as control versus chaos.
Right. A novel virus shuts down the globe. Supply chains freeze, borders close, schools empty out.
But the psychological trauma of 2020 wasn't just the fear of the illness itself.
No, it was the sudden, shocking realization that the intricate, invisible systems we relied on, like grocery store logistics, childcare networks, economic safety nets, were astonishingly fragile.
It was the realization that humanity, despite all its technological arrogance, was not actually in control.
Time slowed down to a crawl because we were physically confined to our homes, but our internal anxiety accelerated to a fever pitch.
You had this universal, simultaneous loss of personal agency.
And the natural psychological response to that level of sustained chaos is to desperately cling to any promise of a solution.
People needed a silver bullet.
Exactly. Which sets up the profound disappointment of 2021.
Let's move to 2021. The framework notes the tension shifts from control versus chaos to hope versus distrust.
Logically, the rollout of the vaccines and the gradual reopening of the economy should have been the grand pressure release valve.
It should have been a moment of collective triumph. We made a vaccine in record time.
But psychologically, it became the ultimate wedge.
Why? Because of those cracks from the 2010s.
Exactly. The cracks from the 2010s had never been repaired. They were just waiting to be exploited. Information was still algorithmically siloed, and institutional trust was still at rock bottom.
So instead of unity, the solutions themselves became proxies for identity.
We fractured over the science, over municipal mandates, over the very definition of civic duty versus personal liberty.
So the psychological realization of 2021 was incredibly bleak. People realized that even the literal cure for our physical isolation was going to drive us further apart culturally.
It's a tragic irony, really.
So if 2021 proved that our solutions were polarizing, how did the human psyche handle 2022?
The framework labels 2022 as recovery versus reality.
Wait, I have to push back on that. Looking back at the data, calling it a recovery feels like a cruel joke.
It does feel that way.
Let's break down the mechanics of what actually happened. The economy was technically forced back open, people went back to offices, travel resumed. But the friction was unbearable.
It was unbearable because the macro environment had fundamentally altered.
You had the outbreak of the largest land war in Europe since World War II with the invasion of Ukraine.
Which immediately destabilized global energy and food markets.
But the most direct, visceral shock to the average person was inflation.
Yes, absolutely.
Let's talk about that inflation, because you cannot understand the psychology of the 2020s without understanding this specific number.
It's a huge factor.
In June of 2022, inflation spiked to 9.1%.
That was the highest annual increase since 1981.
And it is so easy to read that as just an economic statistic, but think about the psychological betrayal that represents to you, the listener.
Right.
You spent 2 years terrified, locked down, losing jobs, maybe losing loved ones. You did everything society asked you to do to survive.
And their reward for making it to the other side was realizing they could no longer afford basic groceries or gas to get to work.
Exactly. So is it fair to say that 2022 was the year the fantasy of a return to normal officially died?
I would argue it was the year it was violently put to rest.
The underlying psychology here is that recovery is not the same thing as relief.
People were physically moving again, but they were carrying the unacknowledged trauma of the past 2 years, only to find the cost of survival had surged by double digits.
The baseline of reality had shifted, and there was a pervasive sense of exhaustion.
And it's right at that moment of peak exhaustion that the timeline shifts into 2023.
2023. The framework themes this year as acceleration versus overwhelm.
And this is entirely driven by the explosion of generative artificial intelligence.
Right. OpenAI launched ChatGPT late in 2022. But 2023 was the year it infiltrated the mainstream consciousness.
And I have to say, the timing of this is almost darkly comedic.
Right. It was like society was already driving a beat-up car at 100 miles an hour on a spare tire, totally exhausted, and then the tech industry decided to strap a rocket engine to the roof.
That is a highly accurate mechanistic description.
Because AI didn't just introduce a new tool, it introduced an entirely new velocity to culture and work.
The human experience in 2023 was defined by this bizarre cocktail of sheer awe and deep, paralyzing fatigue.
You had infinite digital possibility, like the ability to generate art, code, and text in seconds.
Colliding with a population that barely had the energy to process an email.
People were legitimately asking, can my brain actually keep up with the speed at which reality is now being generated?
And for many, the answer was a terrifying no.
Which leads us into 2024, choice versus consequence. The framework highlight 2024 as a pressure cooker of urgency.
Because the world was moving so fast, every structural decision felt existential.
You had major global elections, massive court rulings.
Polarization reached a fever pitch because people felt that the choices being made weren't just about policy adjustments. They were about cementing the new rules of reality before the concrete tried.
And that urgency transitions into 2025, which the framework labels adaptation versus identity.
Right. By 2025, the initial shock of the AI explosion and the post-pandemic economic weirdness had begun to settle into a permanent, undeniable reality.
Generative AI became normalized in corporate workflows. Hybrid work, this messy blend of home and office, became structurally entrenched.
And the psychological shift here is profound. People stopped reacting to the initial trauma and started the incredibly difficult work of figuring out who they had become within this new, highly volatile system.
And this brings us back to those internal coping mechanisms we discussed, the subpersonalities.
Yes, the framework argues that as the external world went through this violent 5-year transformation, our internal survival tools had to evolve too.
The Addy and Bannock personas from the 2010s weren't enough to handle a global pandemic or an AI revolution.
Exactly. The framework introduces an evolved set of personas to map how we navigated the 2020s.
Let's talk about the early phase, 2020 and 2021, when the absolute collapse of physical safety and basic routine was the primary threat.
Right. The dominant psychological postures then were Kelly and Kenny.
Break those down for me. What does a Kenny look like in the middle of a lockdown?
So Kenny represents the desperate human desire for tangibility when the abstract world feels incredibly dangerous and slippery.
Okay.
Kenny is the part of us that reacted to the chaos by trying to establish absolute physical control over whatever tiny domain we had left.
Oh, like the person hoarding toilet paper?
Exactly. Or planting a massive vegetable garden, or obsessively organizing the garage.
It's a grounding mechanic.
If the geopolitical world is falling apart, Kenny says, at least I know exactly where my canned goods are.
That makes perfect sense. And Kelly,
Kelly represents the hyper-empathetic caretaking response.
the person making sure everyone else is okay.
Right. Kelly is the persona that absorbed the heavy emotional weight of everyone's suffering. Kelly was sewing masks, checking on elderly neighbors, and constantly monitoring the emotional temperature of the household.
But the problem with the Kelly persona is that it has no boundaries.
None at all. By the time we hit the inflation shocks of 2022, the Kellys of the world were completely, utterly depleted.
So the safety and caretaking mechanisms burn out. And then the AI rocket engine fires up in 2023. How does the psyche pivot then?
It shifts gears completely toward personas like Tommy and an evolved version of Liz. Tommy is the part of us that becomes absolutely hypnotized by the new tools. Tommy is the early adopter.
The guy writing hundreds of prompts into Midjourney trying to build AI workflows.
Yes, overwhelmed by the creative explosion, but completely disconnected from the physical reality of the exhaustion around him. Tommy tries to outrun the chaos by surfing on top of it.
And the evolved Liz?
She is still out there just trying to perform and maintain influence, but now she's doing it in a world where AI can instantly generate a fake video of her. It's an arms race of perception.
Wow. But here's where the framework gets to what I think is its most profound insight.
The generational piece.
Exactly. Because this timeline we just walked through, from the lockdowns to the inflation to the AI boom, was happening to everyone simultaneously.
But it was being processed by brains at entirely different stages of biological and psychological development.
And this created massive, often invisible friction.
Yes, the generational disconnect. It is one thing to survive a period of historical turbulence. It is another thing entirely to try and form your foundational sense of self during it.
The framework argues that right now we are essentially living in four parallel realities occupying the exact same physical space.
That's right.
I love the way this is structured. Let's use a very grounded scenario for you listening. Imagine a family dinner table in late 2024 or 2025.
Okay, setting the scene.
You have four different generations sitting around the table eating the same meal, but psychologically they are living on different planets.
Let's start with the youngest demographic. Children, roughly ages 0 to 12.
For this demographic, the defining psychological jutting line is simply, the world just is this way.
It's crucial to understand that they have absolutely no conscious memory of the before.
Right. For a 10-year-old in 2025, the idea that adults used to go to an office 5 days a week, or that people didn't wear masks during flu season, or that you couldn't talk to a computer and have it talk back in a human voice, that is ancient history.
The iPad isn't a tool to them. It's practically a biological appendage.
The framework notes that for these kids, there is no hard boundary between the physical world and the digital world.
Playing tag in the backyard and building a server in Roblox are treated with the exact same level of reality.
They map closely to that adaptable Addy persona we talked about earlier.
They are highly resilient, they normalize the chaos instantly, but they're also deeply vulnerable to the ambient, unspoken anxiety of the adults around them.
Because they don't know why mom and dad are stressed about grocery prices, they just absorb the tension.
Exactly. Now move one seat over at the table to the teenagers, ages 13 to 19.
Their core developmental question is totally different.
They aren't normalizing the world. They're asking, who am I in front of everyone?
Because the adolescent brain is hardwired for social navigation and identity formation.
But the framework points out a terrifying modern reality. For teenagers in the 2020s, identity formation is happening in a panopticon.
A panopticon where the guards are algorithms.
Yes. Everything they do, every awkward phase, every mistake, every joke is recorded, quantified by metrics, and constantly compared to a global standard of perfection.
They are literally performing their reality.
They map heavily to the Liz persona and a new one the text calls MAC, which is hyper-focused on complex social navigation.
Think about the cognitive load on a teenager right now.
It's staggering. They are highly fluent in the language of global politics and clinical psychology.
But instead of making them empowered, it often just makes them paralyzed.
They feel like they are constantly being evaluated by an invisible, unforgiving audience, which drives massive spikes in generalized anxiety.
Which brings us to the adults at the table, roughly ages 20 to 50.
The ones carrying the load.
And if you are in this demographic listening to this right now, I want you to ask yourself, how many times this week have you felt like you are doing absolutely everything right, but somehow you are still falling behind?
Because the defining question for the adult demographic is simply, how do I build a life that actually works?
This is the group carrying the physical and structural burden of the era.
They map perfectly to the exhausted Bannock persona, the grounding Kenny, and a persona called Val, who represents the desperate attempt to impose structure on chaos.
The fundamental pressure on this group is that they entered adulthood believing in a specific set of rules.
Right. Go to college, get a job, buy a house, save for retirement.
But the macroeconomic realities of the 2020s completely rewrote those rules midway through the game, and nobody bothered to tell them.
It's the crushing friction between incredible technological leverage, you can start a global business from your laptop, and bizarre physical scarcity.
You might be a highly paid knowledge worker, but you can't afford a starter home because mortgage rates doubled and institutional investors bought up the neighborhood.
You are carrying the stress of the children, the anxiety of the teenagers, and the confusion of the elders, all while trying to optimize your own productivity.
Speaking of the elders, that leads us to the 50-plus demographic at the table.
Their defining psychological state is a deep, disorienting questioning. What happened to the world I knew?
They are the only group at this dinner table that has a fully formed lived experience of multiple distinct versions of reality.
They remember a world before the internet. They remember a time before the hyper-financialization of the housing market.
So they don't just experience the changes of the 2020s as a fast-paced evolution. They experience it as an alienation.
They map to the Devon persona, deeply skeptical of the new digital systems, and a persona called Tira, who represents deep reflection and a mourning for the loss of a shared, stable reality.
So look at this dinner table.
It's a mess.
The adults are completely burnt out and think the teens are chronically, toxically online.
The teens think the adults are emotionally rigid and completely misunderstand the intense pressure of existing publicly on the internet.
The elders are sitting there feeling like society has completely lost the plot and discarded everything of value.
And the children are just wondering why everyone is practically vibrating with tension.
It is a profound developmental divide.
And the danger is that we often mistake this for a simple ideological disagreement or a classic kids these days generational gap.
It's not.
No, it is an environment where every single person is desperately trying to construct a stable identity, but they are being forced to use completely different incompatible toolkits to do it.
And as if that internal psychological friction wasn't enough, we have to look at how these tensions manifested in the physical world.
The external pillars of our daily lives.
Right. The psychological pressure didn't just stay neatly in our heads. It radically reshaped these pillars.
The framework breaks this down into three core areas: economics, politics, and technology.
Let's tackle the economics first, because this is the anvil that the adult demographic is currently being hammered against. The framework refers to it as the chronic squeeze.
The macroeconomic data here is staggering, and it explains the Bannock burnout perfectly.
Right.
The framework cites data from the USDA reporting that all food prices rose by 23.6% between 2020 and 2024.
That is an astonishing, violent shock to the baseline cost of human survival.
It really is.
Stop and really think about the mechanics of that 23.6%. You walk into your local grocery store, you buy the exact same carton of eggs, the same chicken breasts, the same frozen vegetables, and the same loaf of bread that you bought 4 years ago.
You haven't upgraded your lifestyle.
You aren't buying luxury goods. You are just trying to feed your family. And it costs you nearly a quarter more.
And your wages absolutely did not rise by 23.6% in that same window.
That gap, the space between your stagnant paycheck and your exploding grocery bill, is where the psychological trauma lives.
It's the daily ambient panic of standing at a checkout counter and wondering if your card is going to decline.
And it extends far beyond groceries.
The framework details the sharp climb in housing costs, creating what economists call mortgage lock-in.
Oh, this is huge.
People who secured low rates in the 2010s literally cannot afford to move, freezing the housing market and completely locking younger generations out of homeownership.
Which creates a reliance on the gig economy just to bridge the gap.
You have a society where an alarming number of people hold a primary job but still have to drive for Uber or piece together freelance work at night just to maintain a baseline standard of living.
It is the psychological erosion of doing everything right on paper but feeling perpetually humiliatingly broke in practice.
And when a population is under that much sustained economic pressure, the political and legal systems inevitably begin to buckle.
Which brings us to the second pillar, politics and law.
The framework describes the 2020s as a period of extreme institutional stress.
And again, to remind you, the listener, we are looking at this purely through the lens of structural mechanics and velocity, not ideological preference.
Right. The framework maps an astonishing pendulum swing in the executive branch, from the Trump administration's aggressive disruption to the Biden administration's massive spending and regulatory shifts, and then the whiplash of transitioning back to a Trump administration in 2025.
But the executive branch is only part of the story.
The framework places intense focus on a series of rapid-fire foundational shifts at the Supreme Court level that fundamentally rewired American life in the span of roughly 36 months.
The sheer volume of these changes is breathtaking. The framework explicitly lists them out as structural shocks.
Let's walk through that.
You have the Dobbs decision in 2022, which ended the constitutional right to abortion, instantly shifting massive healthcare and legal realities back to the state level.
You have the Bruin decision, which dramatically expanded public carry gun rights and rewrote how lower courts are allowed to evaluate firearm regulations.
You have the Students for Fair Admissions case, which effectively ended race-conscious affirmative action in higher education, upending decades of university admissions policies.
You have the ruling on presidential immunity, which alters the fundamental legal boundaries of the executive office.
And critically, from a purely operational standpoint, you have the Loper-Bright decision, which overturned a precedent known as Chevron deference.
Okay, let's unpack that one.
Yeah, Chevron deference is a deeply legalistic term that makes most people's eyes glaze over. But we need to explain the mechanics of it because it is quietly one of the most massive structural shifts in modern governance.
Simply put, for 40 years, under Chevron deference, if a law passed by Congress was vague, The courts would defer to the experts at federal regulatory agencies.
Like the EPA or the FDA or the Department of Labor?
Exactly. Those agencies would interpret and enforce the details. If Congress said, keep the air clean, the scientists at the EPA got to decide exactly how many parts per million of a specific chemical were legally allowed in the air.
Right. And overturning that means the power of those federal agencies is drastically reduced.
Now, instead of scientists or agency experts making those regulatory calls, it falls to federal judges, who are not scientists, environmental engineers, or labor experts, to interpret the boundaries of those regulations.
Regardless of whether you think federal agencies were overreaching or whether you think this is a disastrous deregulation, the mechanical reality is that it completely paralyzes and rewrites the way workplace safety, environmental protections, and consumer goods are managed.
Precisely. When you take the cumulative weight of all these decisions, reproductive rights, gun laws, educational access, regulatory power, and executive authority, you are looking at the fundamental rulebook of society being heavily edited, erased, and rewritten simultaneously.
It generates a profound sense of systemic vertigo. People feel like the ground they're standing on is constantly shifting underneath them.
And while the economic ground and the legal ground are shifting, the third pillar, technology and media, is completely rewriting how we perceive that instability.
The framework points out that by the mid-2020s, intelligent systems are mediating absolutely everything we do.
Look at the workplace. The framework cites the Bureau of Labor Statistics, noting that by the first quarter of 2024, nearly 25% of employed adults over the age of 25 were working from home at least some of the time.
Which means the physical office, one of the last remaining mandatory centralized shared physical spaces in adult life, was permanently fractured.
We decentralized the workforce.
But the more alarming decentralization happened in how we consume reality itself.
The media consumption statistics in this framework are staggering.
They really are. The framework notes that by 2025, 38% of adults were getting their news on Facebook and 35% were getting it on YouTube.
But here's the number that completely stopped me in my tracks.
Tell me.
43% of adults under the age of 30 were regularly getting their news on TikTok.
Oh, wow. Let's examine the mechanics of that.
It means nearly half of the young adult population is constructing their understanding of complex global geopolitics, economic policy, and local events through a highly addictive short-form video platform.
A platform whose underlying algorithm is explicitly engineered not for journalistic rigor, historical context, or nuance, but for maximum emotional engagement and retention.
The algorithm feeds you the reality that is statistically most likely to keep your eyes on the screen.
Which is almost always the most polarizing, anxiety-inducing reality available.
Exactly.
So step back and look at the totality of this picture. Put yourself in the shoes of the listener right now.
Okay.
If your grocery bill is up nearly 24% and you have to drive an Uber on weekends to afford rent, if the fundamental constitutional laws governing your body, your workplace, and your community are flipping back and forth at breakneck speed, if your office is now your kitchen table isolating you from your peers,
and if your entire understanding of this chaotic world is being delivered to you in hyper-compressed, emotionally volatile 60-second bursts by a TikTok algorithm.
how is the average human being supposed to feel anything other than constantly vigilant, deeply cynical, and utterly exhausted?
They cannot. The human nervous system is not designed to process that much simultaneous structural instability.
The framework's conclusion here is brilliant. It observes that life in the 2020s became intensely personal and intensely global at the exact same time.
We lost the buffer zones.
Explain the mechanics of that lost buffer. What does it mean that life became personal and global?
Historically, a geopolitical event took time to trickle down to the individual. Today, there is zero latency.
So things hit you immediately.
A war breaks out on the other side of the planet, and within days, global supply chains react, and you feel the literal cost of that war at your local gas pump on Tuesday morning.
A novel virus emerges in a distant city, and within weeks, your child's elementary school shuts down indefinitely.
The distance between macroeconomic geopolitical shifts and your personal daily survival shrank to zero. Every global shock is immediately a deeply personal crisis.
Which perfectly sets the stage for where the framework places us right now.
Because this document doesn't just look backward, it provides a real-time reality check for the first quarter of 2026.
And I have to be honest, reading the assessment of our present moment, it does not look like things are calming down.
No, it feels like all these macro and micro tensions we just explored are colliding all at once.
Yes, the data from early 2026 strongly suggests that the late 2020s are actually accelerating, not decelerating.
The framework points directly to the new, localized conflict in the Middle East, centered on Iran.
This isn't just a distant geopolitical tragedy. It is actively disrupting global energy markets.
And more importantly, it is rattling global bond markets.
Let's translate that for the listener. What does it actually mean for a normal person when the global bond markets get rattled? Because that sounds like Wall Street jargon.
When bond markets get rattled, it means investors are terrified of instability and inflation, so they demand higher interest rates to lend money.
Okay, and when those rates spike, it trickles down instantly.
It means the cost of borrowing money for a government goes up, which limits what they can spend on domestic infrastructure.
But for you, the individual, it means your mortgage rates stay high, credit card interest becomes punishing, and the cost of getting a loan to start a small business becomes prohibitive.
It's the immediate reintroduction of energy-driven inflation, just as the working class thought the economic fever was finally breaking.
And while the global markets are trembling, the domestic political situation is described in the framework as deeply procedural and intensely combative.
It's not just ideological debate, it's the actual machinery of government jamming up.
The text highlights a recent 36-day partial U.S. government shutdown over Department of Homeland Security funding.
And it notes that in February 2026, the Supreme Court struck down Trump's global tariffs, which has immediately plunged the international trade landscape back into bureaucratic chaos and renewed conflict.
It is pure structural gridlock.
Simultaneously, we cannot forget the technology pillar. The AI sector is not pausing to let human society catch its breath.
The framework details a rapidly accelerating high-stakes AI arms race.
The U.S. government is currently considering implementing much tougher export rules for AI chips in an attempt to maintain geopolitical dominance.
Even as the global corporate demand for AI infrastructure and data centers absolutely skyrockets.
So we are essentially looking at severe geopolitical anxiety, a gridlocked and combative domestic government, and intense economic unevenness.
All happening alongside the fastest, most disruptive technological leap in the history of human civilization.
It sounds like we were all really hoping the second half of the 2020s would be the cool-down lap.
We ran the pandemic marathon, we trudged up the brutal hill of 9.1% inflation, and we just wanted to jog it out and catch our breath.
But instead, it feels like the treadmill just got cranked up to an absolute sprint.
The incline got set to maximum, and someone turned off the lights in the gym. We are running in the dark.
And that leads to the final critical piece of this framework. Looking at this dark, high-speed treadmill, the document outlines 3 distinct, mechanistic scenarios for how the rest of the 2020s might actually play out from this point forward.
Let's start with the optimistic view. The best-case scenario. I am desperate for a best-case scenario. Give it to me.
Well, in the best-case scenario, we experience what the framework calls a messy recovery.
Okay, messy, but a recovery.
The mechanics here are that the Iran-centered conflict is successfully contained from becoming a broader regional war.
Energy prices stabilize, which allows the global inflation wave to finally genuinely recede.
Domestically, our political institutions remain battered, trust remains low, and the system is bruised, but it remains functional enough to pass basic budgets and avoid default.
And the crucial pivot in this scenario is technological. AI actually begins to drive real, tangible productivity gains across the economy, creating new industries and efficiencies rather than just displacing existing human workers.
I'll take a messy recovery. But realistically, we have to look at the dark side of the coin. The worst-case scenario.
The framework uses a deeply chilling phrase for this: a stagflationary legitimacy crisis.
We need to unpack that because those are heavy economic and political terms.
Stagflation is the absolute nightmare scenario for an economy, right?
Yes, stagflation is the toxic combination of high, persistent inflation and stagnant economic growth paired with high unemployment.
Mechanistically, in this worst-case scenario, the overseas conflict broadens, causing massive, sustained energy shocks.
The cost of everything skyrockets again, which forces central banks to keep interest rates punishingly high.
Which chokes off business investment and pushes the global economy into a severe, grinding recession.
And the legitimacy crisis, part of that phrase.
That is the political fallout. When a population is subjected to a severe recession while costs are still rising, domestic politics hardens from mere polarization into a state of permanent, unresolvable crisis.
Citizens look at the government, see that it cannot provide basic economic stability or function, and fundamentally withdraw their consent to be governed.
They stop believing the institutions have the legitimate right to make the rules.
And in this dark scenario, AI continues to advance rapidly, but it acts strictly as a destructive force, displacing millions of knowledge workers and hollowing out the middle class without generating any meaningful new wage growth to compensate them.
It is systemic failure.
That is an incredibly bleak, terrifying picture. High prices, no jobs, no trust, and a government paralyzed by infighting.
But the framework doesn't think either of the extremes is where we land.
Right, it argues for a most likely scenario, which sits in the murky middle.
It predicts a prolonged period of chronic strain and selective adaptation.
Precisely. The most likely scenario is that we simply muddle through. The world remains geopolitically anxious, and the economy remains fiercely uneven.
Some sectors thrive massively due to AI, while others are hollowed out.
The pace of technological change remains blistering. We don't get a clean, satisfying resolution where everything goes back to normal, but we also don't suffer a total apocalyptic collapse.
We just keep limping forward, adapting to the shocks as they come.
Yes. The framework's ultimate thesis is that the back half of the 2020s is a profound pressure test.
It is going to test whether modern, complex societies can absorb repeated, compounding shocks without losing their underlying psychological and political legitimacy.
It describes the current moment as an improvisational era.
Blind optimism might be in very short supply right now, but resilience, the mechanistic ability of a system or a human being to take a massive hit, reconfigure itself, and keep functioning will matter far more than optimism ever could.
This has been an incredibly heavy, dense, but I think deeply necessary deep dive.
When you zoom out and look at the total suffocating compression of the 2020s so far, this decade that warped the old systems in the 2010s, shattered them with the pandemic, crushed us with inflation, and is now rebuilding reality with artificial intelligence, it makes absolute logical sense why every single one of us feels the way we do.
If you are listening to this and you have felt crazy or burnt out or overwhelmed, you aren't crazy.
The world actually is moving this fast. The physical and psychological demands being placed on you are historically unprecedented.
The historical context is the only way to find your footing. We are currently living in the messy, chaotic transition space between the digital disruption of the 2010s and whatever new equilibrium we managed to construct in the 2030s.
We are the bridge.
And being the bridge is exhausting.
The framework asks if we can learn to live with this instability. But as we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you go about the rest of your day.
Building on everything we've just discussed, what if the ultimate defining skill of the 21st century isn't just gritting your teeth and surviving this constant instability?
What if the goal isn't just to endure the shocks? What if the people, the families, and the societies that truly thrive in the 2030s are the ones who stop desperately trying to rebuild the rigid, comfortable, predictable structures of the past and instead actually master the art of the pivot?
What if agility becomes the new stability?
That is the defining question of our era. Are we going to keep trying to put the warped window of the 2010s back together out of nostalgia, or are we finally ready to accept the breakage and build a completely new house?
We might be sprinting on a treadmill in the dark right now, but maybe it's time we realize we are the ones who can reach out and control the speed.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. It's always an absolute privilege unpacking these massive, world-shifting ideas with you. Stay curious, stay resilient, and we will catch you next time.